Hello, welcome to KSK Historical Accounts. We are back on our lessons. As promised, we are going to continue on how to determine the range of years in a century and the century in which each year falls. So, in effect, we are saying that how easier will it be for us to determine the century in which any year that we meet falls. So how are we going to quickly know that the year or this particular year falls in this century? We did start this lesson in our previous video and we are going to continue today. But a short recap in a minute. In our previous video, we learned that a century is a period of 100 years. And that we learned that the first century starts from day one, which is part of year one, up to the 100th year, the first 100th year. So from year one to year 100, that range of years becomes the first century. And that we also, from there, learned how to determine the beginning year of every century apart from the first century. And we learned from our first lesson that the previous year plus one, the ending year of the previous century plus one gives us the beginning year of every century. So let's say if you are talking about second century, the first century ends at year 100. So 100 plus 1, which is 101, becomes the beginning year of the second century. And the second example, let's say third century. So third century ends, begins with a year, but the previous century or the immediate century before the third century is the second century. And the second century ends at year 200. So 200 plus 1 gives you 201, which is the beginning year of the third century. Today, we are going to look at a simple policy, a simple strategy, or a simple method for which you can also deduce or learn from to determine the ending year. So we learned that the range of years is with the beginning year and the ending year. So the beginning year, which we have learned that the ending year of the previous century plus 1 becomes the beginning year of the century we are talking about. Now, how then do we determine the ending year so that we can get the complete range of years for a century? So, assuming you are to determine the ending year of second century or third century or fourth century, how do we do it? This is the rule. The rule says that to So this is the rule. To determine the ending year of any century, just pick the number of that century and write 2 zeros behind it. It's easy, right? To determine the ending year of any century, just pick the number that century puts out, and then you add 2 zeros, or you write 2 zeros behind it, and it becomes quickly. So let's see example. We are talking about, let's say, 10th century. 10th century. So if you want to determine the ending year, or when 10th century, the year that 10th century ended or will end, what do you do? What number is 10th century producing? 10, right? So it's easy to determine. 10th century, 10. So you just write number 10. That is our 10. And then you write 2 zeros behind it. Then you get 1,000. Or you can say 1,000. And that becomes the ending year of that century. That is the 10th century. Let's try another example. Example 2. Let's say 5th century. So 5th century. 5th century. So what number is 5th century producing? 5, right? So you get 5. That is our 5. And you write 2 zeros, as we have already noticed, behind it. So you have our 2 zeros. So we have 500. So what it means is that the 5th century will end in year 500. Amazing. This is the rule number 2 for you. And that brings us to the end of today's section. But before we go, let's add one more example and then we go. Let's go to, which century is that? 30th century, and see. So 30th century, example 3. So 30th century, that is 30th century. So which number does 30th century produces? I know you have said in your room or wherever you are that 30, and you are right. Thumbs up for you. So you have 30. Then you write your 2 zeros as the rule states behind your 30. And what do you get? 3,000. So that means that when we get to the 30th century, now that we later will know the century we are in, if we get to the 30th century after death or in our era, we will then know that 30th century will be ending at year 3000. 30, then 2 zeros behind it, year 3000, and we get the ending year. This is interesting, very easy. Before this video, I think it was complex for you, but now you have been able to do this in 2 lessons. The first lesson helping us to determine the beginning year, and the second lesson helping us to determine the ending year. So now we have the range. So you should, after going through these first 2 lessons, you should be able to determine the range of years for any century that you'll be given, because we have been able to determine the beginning year, and we have been able to also determine the ending year. I entreat you to go through, learn them quickly, and then you will be very much abreast with anything that pertains to determine a year and determine which century that year falls in. The range of years and the year the century any year falls in. So that brings us to the end. And so I entreat teachers to subscribe, as well as learners. Come to KSK Historical Accounts, learn from here, subscribe and recommend, share with your friends to also come. And your comments are also there. If there are any additions, something that you think that should have been added to make this lesson interesting that it didn't come and you will upgrade next time. Thank you for giving us your attention. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. Bye bye.